Sometimes in life you just get super lucky. For instance, I'm super lucky to have an incredible photo lab just a 10-minute walk from my apartment. I'm talking of course about my local lab here in Brooklyn, Exposure Therapy. I've been going to them for over 2 years now and they always treat me right and they are extremely professional. And of course I'm bringing them up because they recently allowed me to borrow one of their cameras. You all saw the thumbnail and the title, so there's no use hiding it. They let me borrow their Pentax 17. A brand new film camera manufactured by Pentax in the year of our Lord, 2024. Kinda crazy, and certainly something that a lot of the film community was talking about like 2 months ago. I bring all of this up to point out something up top, that I wasn't really planning on getting this camera. Don't get me wrong, I'm super excited that this thing exists, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty in just a bit. But half frame just isn't really appealing to me, and frankly, financially I just couldn't swing buying this camera when it first came out. But when Exposure Therapy offered to let me borrow it, I jumped at the opportunity. If anything, just to see if I would get converted to being a half-frame believer. So you'll have to stick around till later in the video to find out. But for now, what is this camera? Well, like I said, it's a brand new camera from a legacy camera manufacturer, Ricoh Pentax. For years now, the analog world has been dominated by the used camera market, and now we have our first newly manufactured camera in well over a decade. Why the name Pentax 17? Well, as mentioned earlier, this is a half-frame camera. If you're not familiar, 35mm film, when shot in a standard 35mm camera, measures frames of 24mm tall by 36mm wide. Well, when you use a half-frame camera, you're splitting the size of the frame in half down the center. So our new dimensions come out to 24mm tall by 17mm wide, hence the name Pentax 17. Now, shooting half-frame can have its advantages and its disadvantages, and we'll get to those in a little bit, but for now, let's see what I was able to shoot with the Pentax 17. So like I said, half-frame cameras can be a unique addition to your camera arsenal, but they can come with a price, and I'm not exactly talking about money. For starters, in a 36 exposure roll of 35mm film, you'll be getting 72 exposures, so you'll double the amount of images per roll. This can actually help with the more casual film shooters who don't want to be spending so much money and don't want to be buying new rolls of film every other week. The main downside of shooting half-frame is that the smaller frame size makes getting high-resolution scans of your photos less likely or more limited. But again, this is a camera aimed at casual shooters or people just getting into film photography, and we have to remind ourselves of that not everyone needs and desires are going to match our own. So I've been out here for a while, maybe not a while, maybe like 2 hours or so, and I just looked down at the frame counter and I am at 20 frames. I really thought I had shot way more than that, but I'm not even halfway through. So let's get to the specs of the camera. It comes equipped with a 25mm lens, which is equivalent to 37mm in standard 35mm format. It has a maximum aperture of f3.5. It has a program AE electronic shutter that goes from 4 seconds to 1/350th of a second, plus a bulb mode. The focusing system is a manual operated zone focusing system. More on that in just a second. It comes with 6 shooting modes, which I know was a bit confusing at first for some folks, myself included. First, we have full auto, in which the camera will read the scene and make all of the decisions for you, whether you need flash or no flash. This mode allows for more casual and effortless picture taking without worrying about camera operations. Then we have standard or P mode with the flash off. The settings within the white border all have the flash disengaged. This standard mode is highly useful in daylight photography. Slow speed shutter mode lets you select the desired focus zone without flash being discharged, making it ideal for twilight photography. And then bokeh mode or bokeh mode, however you want to say it, this is just a maximum aperture priority where it will favor that f3.5 aperture. Then we've got bulb mode with the flash off. What they call daylight sync mode is a program mode with the flash on. Since the flash makes a discharge, this is ideal for photographs taken against backlit or poorly illuminated locations. Then we have slow speed sync with the flash on for night photography. This is useful in situations where you want to brightly illuminate a subject in the foreground while retaining the ambiance of a nightscape or twilight in the background. On the top of the camera, we find the ISO selector that has a lock. You have to press the button to rotate it. We have the exposure compensation dial, an interesting feature that you might not expect on this camera. You have the shooting mode selector, which we covered. You have the on-off switch and the shutter release button, the film advance lever, and the frame counter. We could also see the 6 different zone focusing settings. The mountains are for far distance. This zone sets the focus from 5.1 meters to infinity, making it ideal for scenic photography and long-distance shooting. Next is the family of 3, which is medium distance. This zone sets the focus from 2.1 to 5.3 meters, making it useful for medium-range photography such as group photos. This bifurcated man down the center is close distance. This zone sets the focus from 1.4 to 2.2 meters, making it handy for taking casual snapshots of personal effects from an eye-pleasing distance. This whole man represents extremely close distance, setting the focus from 1 meter to 1.4 meters. This zone is useful in capturing close-up photos of friends or groups. And the one with the fork and knife is the tabletop photo. This setting sets the focus from 0.47 to 0.54 meters, which is useful for capturing tabletop photos at locations such as cafes and restaurants. And then we have the flower, which is macro. This setting sets the focus from 0.24 to 0.26 meters for capturing fine detailed photos of small objects, such as flowers or creating dramatic macro images. Now it should be noted that because the Pentax 17 isn't an SLR and it doesn't have a mirror inside of it, it does have a parallax effect when you're using the tabletop and the macro focusing zones. So when photographing in these zones, you're advised to frame the image using the parallax compensation frame indicated in the viewfinder, which is the smaller frame lines. Speaking of which, let's talk about the viewfinder. The Pentax 17's optical viewfinder features an Albata type bright frame finder with frame guides. And like I said, you'll want to be using the large frame lines for anything other than tabletop or macro photos. Just be sure to remember that. And one cool thing is that the zone focusing setting that you're on can be confirmed through the viewfinder. And next to the viewfinder, you'll find 2 indicator lamps. These indicator lights will blink as warnings to prevent operational errors, such as like when you attempt to take photos with a lens cap on, or you forget to advance to the next frame, or when you set the focusing mode to macro or tabletop. Alright, I'm back again. I wasn't able to finish shooting the roll the other day. The weather's pretty nice out today. I got a plan. I'm going to Greenwood Cemetery, which I've never been to. It's in Sunset Park. Maybe it's sort of sacrilegious and blasphemous to take photos at a cemetery, but here I go. Alright, I am unloading the roll of Colorplus that I just shot in the Pentax 17. This camera was interesting to use. Just some kind of thoughts to wrap it up. I'm sure that in the studio I'm going to wrap it up, but the camera is somewhat flimsy. There are definitely some pros and cons to this camera. I think the way that I would describe it, like a gateway drug of a camera. You know, it is very obvious and clear when you're using it, who it's intended for. Your absolute novice film shooters, people who have never shot a roll of film in their life. And this also isn't meant to be pejorative. Obviously, there are people out there who have never shot film, and they deserve something like this camera to get them interested, to get them hooked on it, if you will. For a lot of experienced film shooters, I think sometimes it's hard to go back in time and remember the time when you were discovering something, shooting your first roll of film and getting your first set of scans back. It can be an exciting experience, and I think that if this camera can give younger people, newer people to this sort of niche hobby, if you will, if they can give them a chance to experience that feeling, then that's all that really matters. And any sort of review that dismisses this camera on the grounds of it not living up to their expectations or like a professional's expectations, I think they're missing the point entirely. Do I wish there were some more bells and whistles on this camera? Sure. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a film that's being marketed to someone in my position or in a lot of other YouTuber camera reviewers or film shooters. So at the end of the day, the point is kind of moot. What this does give you is ease of use and some some ways where you could take over creatively, make decisions, and at the end of the day, that's sort of all you can really ask for in a beginner camera that is essentially a gateway drug. Now, just to be transparent, I'm recording this portion of the video before I actually get the film developed. See, I've got it right here. It's all shot, it's all ready to be developed. And I'm recording it this way primarily because of scheduling and because I've got to return this back to exposure therapy pretty soon. After I get the scans back, I will come back here and I will expand on all of my thoughts as a whole. But I'm calling this section Notes and Nitpicks because I thought I'd get some of the negatives out of the way right up front. So the first thing I'll mention is that when I first picked this thing up, I didn't quite realize how plastic it was going to feel. A lot of people have been commenting that it feels sturdy, and I do agree, but there is just an element of plasticity to it. Some of the dials on the top were not my favorite thing to use. I think that the exposure compensation dial, while an excellent addition to this camera and pretty interesting to see it on there, on a camera that's meant for beginners, it is kind of small and tough to get. And I have small fingers, so I can only imagine how people with larger fingers are going to have a hard time kind of rotating this. On another note, I personally am just not a fan of the zone focusing system. I'm sure that if I had more time to play with the camera and really, really get used to zone focusing, that it wouldn't appear as scary to me. But I just found myself leaving the camera in auto mode because I was too frightened to be messing around with the zone focusing. I think I started off the roll really trying to use the zone focus, but then I was just sort of like, is this like a one person distance away? Is this the bifurcated man distance away? Or is this tabletop? I don't know. So it was, maybe it was just kind of throwing me off a little bit, and leaving it in auto mode ideally was the way to go. Another thing that I heard Kyle McDougall mention in his video before I had ever even touched this camera, and that I wholly agree with, the camera doesn't show you any of the settings that it's using, and I kind of wish that it would at the very least show you a meter readout of the shutter speed it is planning on using or the f-stop it's planning on using, so that you could have a little bit more of a manual control if you find yourself in a situation where it's requiring 1/15 of a second to leave the shutter open, but you prefer to have it be 1/60th or 1/25th of a second. You could then maybe add the flash if you need more light so that it's not as shaky. I don't know. I wish we sort of knew what decisions the camera was making before it makes them, and just give a little bit more control over the image to the one taking the image. And on that note, I do wish that it had faster shutter speeds, faster than 1/350th of a second. I'm sure that in future iterations of this or any other sort of projects that Pentax and Ricoh have in store, maybe we'll have more of these bells and whistles. So that's going to do it for me in this portion of the video. I do have to return this camera. I'm going to drop off the roll of film, and I'm going to leave it, I'm going to send it over to future Josh, who has had time to sit with the scans from this camera and have much more to say and final thoughts. So stick around for that. And for now, let's say goodbye to this camera. Bye, camera. All right, there it goes. Okay, so future Josh here. I just got the scans back this morning, and you've been seeing them for the entire video, but the takeaway that I have from all of this is that I stand by the sentiment that this is a camera meant to act as sort of a gateway drug. By no means should this be a camera that you use when approaching photography as some sort of profession, or just to use if quality is your number one concern. And I mean that in terms of resolution quality, not in terms of creative or artistic quality of the photographs. Obviously, you could take creatively evocative photos with a half-frame camera. You could take them with any sort of shitty point-and-shoot camera that you have. Also, it should be mentioned that you saw two different types of scans in this video. You have diptychs, and then you have the single-frame scans. So if you're going to your lab with photos that you took on a half-frame camera, it's important to tell them that and decide what kind of scans you want if your lab offers them. The lab that I go to, Exposure Therapy, again, they're just incredible people, and they offer the ability to do both diptychs and single frame scans, which is what I got from them. I found the creative challenge of shooting image pairs to be a fascinating one, and something that I wish I took more care in when I was out shooting the roll, because I think I almost prefer the diptychs to the single frame ones in most cases. And that might be because viewed as diptychs, it fools you into not looking deeper into the photographs, and that sounds harsher than I think I mean it. Okay, on a positive note, the light meter in this camera seems to be really, really solid and on point across the board. All of my photos were well metered, and whatever decisions that the camera was making were pretty solid. On a negative note, though, I'm not really seeing the sharpness I wanted out of the lens. Many times my photos were just plain out of focus or just slightly soft. Like I mentioned before, the zone focusing isn't really for me, and when thrown in auto mode, the camera activates the pan focus program, and the focus is fixed regardless of the zone focus setting that you're on. That is sort of an important note that should be highlighted somewhere. And I don't know, still, it misfocused, and it just, again, looks really soft overall. So wrapping all of this up, the camera is definitely a gateway camera. I feel like I keep repeating that point, and I could absolutely see the appeal to anyone out there interested in getting into film photography themselves, or they're trying to get someone else into it. If you know someone who is interested in it and doesn't have a camera for themselves, I do think that this is almost like something you would get as a Christmas gift for someone without the risk of going into the used camera market. This is an incredibly solid choice. There is a bit of a learning curve when you first get it, but once that's mastered, it's a great tool to experiment with and hone your compositional abilities. But for the photographer who is maybe looking for more manual control over their images, maybe this isn't the camera for that. But as someone who has kind of been staunchly pretty anti point and shoot camera, this feels like a great in-between of a point and shoot like the Pentax SBO 115G and a manual SLR or a rangefinder. And that's actually a pretty important note, I would say. Don't think of this as a point and shoot, because that's limiting it pretty harshly. And don't expect all the bells and whistles you might find in a more professional grade camera. It is a gateway camera, and frankly, that's pretty awesome. I want to give another great big thank you to Exposure Therapy for letting me borrow the camera and for the quick turnaround of these scans. Seriously, if you're in New York City, especially Brooklyn, I know there are other film labs out there, and I'm not shitting on them, but Exposure Therapy has been my go-to for 2 years now. They're my day one, my ride or die, so I highly, highly recommend going to them. If you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button, and then hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified when new videos are released. You could also head to my print shop and consider buying a print and supporting me and supporting this channel. You could also consider buying a novel that I self-published a few months back. You could watch a whole video about it, and it would really mean a whole lot to me. This has been an incredible opportunity. I'm so glad I was able to make this video. Let me know what you think of the Pentax 17 in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you all, and I'll see you all next time.